Let's get a little more now on the 3 Australian military personnel on board the US submarine that sank an Iranian vessel in the Indian Ocean this week. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts joins us. Stephen, how's this news emerged and what's the Prime Minister had to say?
Well, Ros, yesterday speculation was pretty rife about whether Australian personnel might have been on board the US submarine that sank the Iranian frigate earlier this week. That's because the government has made it very public that a large number of Australians, more than 50, have now been rotated through US submarines as part of the AUKUS program, which is essentially trying to train up Australian submariners, engineers and others to make sure they have the skills necessary for Australia to run its own nuclear-powered submarines in the years ahead. Now, yesterday in the Senate, the Greens were pressing the government to provide clarity on this, saying, can you say whether any Australians were on board? The government didn't want to answer that. Late yesterday, the Nine papers essentially broke the news that they said 2 Australian personnel were on board. Again, the government would not confirm that overnight. But then this morning, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has given an interview to Sky News. During that interview, he's made the decision to confirm that yes, there were Australian personnel, 3 it turns out, on board the US submarine. But Anthony Albanese has also been very keen to emphasise that these personnel were not involved in the action against Iran. In other words, they sat out the offensive action which saw this US submarine torpedo the Iranian frigate with substantial loss of life. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
We wouldn't normally confirm such an issue, but given our NSC meetings and the public interest, I can confirm that there were 3 Australian personnel on board that vessel. I can confirm also, though, that no Australian personnel have participated in any offensive action against Iran. These are long-standing third country arrangements that have been in place for a long period of time. And what they do is ensure that Australian Defence Force personnel, where they're embedded in third countries' defence assets, they act in accordance with Australian law, with Australian policy, and that, of course, is taking place across the board.
So is this likely to be politically contentious, Stephen?
It'll certainly draw criticism from some parts of Parliament. I think the Greens might be holding a doorstop as we speak, so we'll see what they have to say. But they've been very critical of this integration of Australia within the US submarine force, saying given the Trump administration's willingness to use force, and Iran is a powerful example of that, that Australia simply should try to disentangle itself, or has to move to disentangle itself from the US military to avoid being drawn in directly or indirectly into these conflicts. I think, though, the coalition is not likely to criticise this decision. Of course, the coalition has been strongly behind AUKUS, and it continues to back the entire partnership, remembering, of course, it was originally a coalition creation. And I imagine their argument will be that this is absolutely necessary, that Australia simply can't develop nuclear-powered submarine capabilities without embedding troops within the submarines of our allies, like the US and the UK. So I don't think there'll be, I think broadly speaking from the major parties, there will be bipartisan support for this.
And what are some of the other implications for Australia?
Well, look, it does lead Australia into fraught territory. In a sense, this is unsurprising simply because there have been so many Australian personnel coming into the US submarine force. That's not to downplay the significance of this story, but in a sense, you know, the fact you've got a US submarine operating under Indo-PACOM, we knew for a fact that numbers of large and growing numbers of Australian personnel were going to be involved in that. It makes sense that personnel are inevitably going to be drawn into these conflicts. Now, the government, as the Prime Minister has said, is going to maintain that we are not meaningfully implicated in any way because our sailors will sit out offensive operations that are not in accordance with Australian policy or Australian law. So they say that will allow Australia to get the training that it needs without creating any diplomatic or legal difficulties for Australia. But of course, even if that's legally very true, there are still going to be political and potentially foreign policy implications from examples like this. What do, for example, the Indians make of an Australian presence on a US submarine doing something that has been interpreted by some within the Indian establishment as an unfriendly act. So yes, legally, the government has got a strong case to make here, but politically and in terms of the foreign policy implications, it does speak to some of the complexities surrounding this hugely ambitious but sometimes fraught AUKUS project.